friends of the Burlington area. I'm delighted to be in this part of the state. This is the megalopolis from the point of view of all the rest of the state. I didn't realize, I knew I was getting to the city and the largest concentration of population in Vermont. When I arrived at the hotel this afternoon, I was sent up to room 622, and I found 622 already occupied by a charming companion. I didn't know we were quite so far advanced in Vermont, but the matter had to be arranged, and I'm now in 620, I think it is, but you never know where I'll end up. This business of after-dinner speaking is really a racket, but I find it both profitable and pleasant, and so I continue. The hour grows late, but I still hope that I may have a chance to introduce you to a little of what I call Vermont wit, humor, and wisdom. As a former professor of history, everything that I say bears all the earmarks of authenticity, although, of course, one does have to take a certain amount of license. I try to get true stories, and a lot of them are, although occasionally I stray from the path. But I wanted to tell you, too, that I picked up just the other day in the Hitchcock Clinic from Dr. Lou Matthews, who is a Southern boy. He grew up south of the Mason-Dixon line in Tennessee. He'd never known anything about New Englanders except that phrase that's always used in the South. He always thought of them as goddamn Yankees. When he got to Hanover, he was assigned an office in Hitchcock Clinic, and he told me that the very first patient that walked through his door was an elderly farmer from Royalton, Vermont. Perspiration was standing out on his brow, his face had a bluish tinge, and he was trembling. And Dr. Matthews said, "Come in, my friend. It's obvious to me you've had a heart attack. Stretch out on the table here, and we'll get another doctor in. I think we can do something for you." So they made a little examination and told him that he'd have to stay. Dr. Matthews said, I turned over to my desk to make a few hurried notes, and as I looked, here was this old Vermonter going out through the door. And I said to him, "Hold on here, mister. Didn't you hear what I said, that you're in a critical condition and that you'll have to stay with us a while?" "Yes," he said, "Doc, I heard you. But God damn it, I'm an old-line Vermonter, and I've got to go home for a week and think this over." He told me he had another Vermonter shortly after that, and he had him in bed. And he went in one morning and he said, "Hello, my friend, how are you?" And the old Vermonter, I wrote this down. Lou spelled it out to me as best he could. I said to him, "How are you?" And the old fellow said, "Well, Doc, I feel savagonus." And Matthew said, "Savagonus? I never heard that word. I don't know what it means." "Well," says the old Vermonter, "neither do I, Doc, but that's the way I feel." Well, now, you can classify Vermont stories in 100 different ways, and I follow different patterns. I thought tonight I'd follow one that I've been using lately, calling attention to one particular characteristic of Vermonters that intrigues me, the characteristic of the quick and, it seems to me, premeditated comeback to a comment or query you may make, which sort of sits you back in your ass. And I'm sure that's part of his purpose and part of his pleasure. They work this particularly on foreigners, as we call them. We welcome them because they bring a little new green folding stuff to Vermont, but sometimes they are a problem. For instance, you know the city fellow who said to the Vermonter, "You have an awful lot of strange people around here, don't you?" And the Vermonter says, "Yes, we do, but most of them are gone by the middle of September." This was not quite what was expected. There's that old one, the very brief one, about the city fellow who says to the Vermonter, "Hello there, Si, you lived here all your life?" And the Vermonter says, "Not yet." It's perfectly obvious, and yet it rather sets you back on your fanny. Walter Piston, the great musician and composer at Harvard, coming up from Tanglewood down in the Berkshires to a performance at Hopkins Center in Hanover, told me that he came to a fork in the roads down in Vermont. He was coming up through Vermont. He came to a fork in the roads where both signs said White River Junction. And there was an old Vermonter there, and Piston said to him, "Does it make any difference which road I take to White River Junction?" And the old fellow says, "Not to me, it don't." There's we can intrude a little on the religious vein. I heard of this evangelist who stopped an old Vermonter and said, "Excuse me, my friend, but have you found Jesus?" And the old fellow says, "God, I didn't know he was lost." We have, living in Norwich, a retired professor of German background with some Prussian characteristics. He rides horse and rides the horse hard. I happen to be in front of, we have only one store left in Norwich. There used to be two. Well, there used to be three at one time. But this was the second store. I happened to be out just going in, and the professor reined up his horse and got off, turned to an old Vermonter sitting on the store porch there, and he says, "Watch my horse." And he went in the store. He came out a few minutes later, and no horse. He turned to the Vermonter, he said, "I thought I told you to watch my horse." The old fellow says, "Well, God, I did. He's down there now, just going around the bend in the road." A couple of more church ones occurred to me. There was the story of the evangelist holding forth, or the minister rather, holding forth in this church about the glories of heaven and the terrors of hell, and pursuing the old methods, which we don't see much now, I guess. He tried to get everybody in the congregation who wanted to go to heaven to stand up. And he encouraged them to, and he'd say, "God bless you, brother," and "God bless your sister," and "Yes, thank you, Charlie." And they all began to stand up till there was only one little old lady left down in the front pew who didn't stand up. And he said, "What's the trouble with you, Aunt Mary? Don't you want to go to heaven?" She said, "Not today. I got company." And there's the story of the fellow who went out to take a church off in the back country as a substitute, and only one man showed up, farmer. And the minister didn't know exactly whether he should go ahead with the service or not, and he said, "What do you think, mister? Should we go ahead with the service?" "Well," says the old Vermonter, "of course, Reverend, I'm just a farmer, but if I put some hay in the wagon and go down to the pasture to feed the cows, and only one cow shows up, I feed her." So the minister took the hint and went on with the whole service. At the end, he wondered how things had gone, and he said, "Well, what did you think of the service?" "Well," he says, "Reverend, of course, as I told you, I'm just a poor farmer, but if I put some hay in the wagon and go down to the pasture to feed the cows, and only one cow shows up, I don't give her the whole damn lot." A couple of other true stories. I saw this happen in myself in our other store, the only surviving store in Norwich, down in Witt's. There's a lady has moved into what on the map is called West Norwich, but which we locally call Beaver Meadow. And she has the complaint that some of these intruders have, or not the complaint, but the misfortune of not adapting readily. I think you have all noticed that some people can come in and settle in Vermont for the summer and they know how to get along. And they get along a hell of a lot better, too, for knowing how. But this lady, we have a self-service store. And you have to take your cart, you know, and push it round. And for some reason or other, she thinks that she shouldn't do that. So she calls up in advance and gives this long list. And these things are all put up. And then she drives in, and the boy brings them out and puts them in the car. And I said to Whit, why do you put up with that? And he says, well, damn it, it's a little money, and you got to play ball. But she doesn't go up any in their estimation. Well, I was in there one day, and she was giving this list over the telephone, and I saw Whit writing down, and I couldn't hear her part, but he told me afterwards that she said, after about item 12, she said, Mr. Hicks, are you still there? And I heard Whit say, yeah, I write quiet. We used to have an English professor at Dartmouth named Fred Parker Emery, who rode a horse much more gently than this other professor I've spoken of. And Emery was a very nice gentleman and he used to like to ride in the summer, and he had the good sense to like to ride across the river in Vermont. And he got way out back in Norwich. He told me this story. He got way out in back country there, out beyond Beaver Meadow. And he came on this lonely farm, and the farmer there in the yard, and Fred stopped his horse and said hello, and the old Vermonter says hello. And Fred says, aren't you sometimes lonesome here? And the old fellow says, I don't know what you're talking about. Professor Emery, somewhat on the defensive, said, well, I just wondered if sometimes you didn't wish you were a little nearer the center of things. The old fellow had been working on this for some time. Well, he's very deliberate about it, and he says, Mister, I'm exactly 5 miles from Norwich, and exactly 5 miles from Stratford. I'm exactly 160 miles from Boston and 160 miles from Montreal. I don't see how a fella could be much nearer to the center of things. And I'm sure that it sometimes gets into writing. There was a fella, you know how we have in this tilted country of Vermont, barns that you could drive in on the upper level on one side and they drop off 2 or 3 stories on the other side. This fellow was up on the roof fixing the shingles, and unfortunately he was on the steep 2 side and he fell off and broke his neck and died. And the family were filling out the insurance forms and date of the accident, place of the accident, nature of the accident, and so on and so forth. And down at the bottom it said remarks. And they wrote he didn't make none. Yeah, this can even apply to people who are suffering temporary mental difficulties. They tell us that over at the state hospital at Waterbury, there were 2 gentlemen who had mental instability and were getting pretty well straightened out. And the nurse was walking them in the yard. And one of them was quite bald-headed, and a bird came along and dropped a calling card on the bald head. And the nurse, feeling that in his disturbed state this might throw him off, she said, now, don't be disturbed at all. You stay right here, and I'll go in the building and get a piece of toilet paper. After she disappeared in the building, he turned to his friend and said, what a damn fool she is. That bird will be a half a mile away before she... And then there's the story of the Vermont Transits, ably represented here tonight. This is a story of a bus. Vermont bus driver was a city fellow with a Great Dane on a leash, you know, somewhat of a sizable beast. And they stopped the bus. The bus driver pulled up and opened the door and looked out, and he says, you can't get on this bus. The city fellow says, why can't I get on this bus? Driver says, no dogs allowed on this bus. City fellow was unreasonable about it, but irked and disturbed, and he said, okay, you know what you can do with your damn bus. Vermonter says, you do the same with a dog, you can get on. Which presents a pretty picture. Well, now, I've discovered that they not only play this game on visiting strangers and summer folk and other intruders, but they also, to keep in practice, play it on each other. And this has become a part of the accepted way in life. Some of my political friends, I like to kid a little with this story. Two old Vermonters went to a political meeting, and there was a politician up front holding forth. One of these fellows was a little hard of hearing, and he turned to his neighbor and he says, what's he talking about? And his neighbor says, he don't say. So it does make a lot of difference what we say, I guess. There's out in this Beaver Meadow place I told you, there was an old fellow who's now gone to his reward named Don Wheeler. He had a brother named Nathaniel Wheeler who for many years ran the Junction House in White River Junction. Some of you may remember that before it was named the Hotel Coolidge, it was the Junction House when White River was a great railroad center. And Nathaniel was quite a boy, too. I hadn't thought of him, but he was quite a fellow. They tell the story about Nathaniel, who was in the lobby there one day, and this lady came bustling up and said, are you the proprietor of this hotel? And Nat says, yes, madam. What's your trouble? Well, she said, I have a complaint. Very well, madam. He said, what's the nature of your complaint? Well, she said, one of your waitresses just spilled some cream on my nice new dress. That, said Nathaniel, is a lie I know from the start, because there's no cream in the house. But Nathaniel was quite a worldly fellow and used to run poker games in the back room and so forth. But Don, this other fellow who lived out in Beaver Meadow, was a horse of a different color and kind of a pathetic figure. I called on him with old Doc Griggs a little while before he died, and he died in sadness in that old house all alone on a dirty mattress wrapped up in dirty blankets. And he said, I'm going to die, and I want to die, and I want to go to hell, because that's where my friends are going to be and so forth. It was kind of sad. But they did, in that last part of his life, persuade him to have a telephone put in. He said he didn't want one of the damn things, but they had it put in. And my friend Charlie Hodgson, who's the road commissioner, told me he was in there visiting with old Don one day, and the telephone, rural style, was ringing insistently, one long, three short, one long, three short, one long, three short, and Charlie says, Don, ain't that your ring? Don says, I don't know, but what is? Well, he said, why in hell don't you answer the telephone? And Don's retort has a lot of Vermont in it, I think. He said, Charlie, I had that phone put in for my convenience. One Vermonter said to another, too bad, isn't it, about George Jones losing his mind? And the other fellow says, yeah, he don't seem to miss it much. Another Vermonter, this is a little sophisticated. One Vermonter said to the other Vermonter, how's your wife? The first fellow says, compared to what? You got to have a point of reference. They tell about this one Vermonter saying to another, oh, excuse me, sir. All right. Have you heard about this population explosion? The other fellow says, yes, my God, I have. It's terrible. They tell me by the year 2000 there'll be stand-in room only. Well, says the first fellow, that ought to slow him down a little. I heard of a fellow over in Woodstock who had spent his summers there and was going to spend year-round there. He was walking down the road one October day and thought he'd get a little friendly with his neighbors. He should have started before. And he met his neighbor, and he said it was a beautiful October day. He said, "Good morning, Mr. Brown. Good morning, Mr. Brown. And how are you, Mr. Brown, on this beautiful October morning?" A way no Vermonter would ever talk, of course. And Mr. Brown says, "None of your damn business." And then he adds, with that real Vermont touch, "And I wouldn't tell you that much if you want a neighbor of mine." I did want to get in a story or two about that gentleman who was born in San Francisco but became the poet laureate of Vermont and spent the latter part of his life in Vermont, Mr. Robert Frost. Now, there was another distinguished Vermonter named Thomas Reed Powell, a graduate of UVM, who became a very distinguished professor of constitutional law at the Harvard Law School. And some friends of mine who were present told me this story. This was quite a long while ago. Thomas Reed Powell invited Robert Frost to spend the evening at his house. And both of them were good talkers and sharp wits, and they were having a good time badgering each other. And finally, Powell, remembering Frost's birthplace in San Francisco, said, "Well, you know, Robert, you're only a bastard Vermonter anyway." Whereupon Frost, quick as a wink, retorted, "Well, Reed, I don't know but what that's better than being a Vermont bastard," which showed Mr. Frost's comeback. Well, I used that on the air over in Hanover, New Hampshire a little while ago, and the college radio station, and the boys came running in saying, "A lady has just called on the telephone and said that Professor Foley has used the term bastard on the air twice. What is this country coming to?" Well, I ran into a lady friend of mine who said, "I understand you had a little trouble with the use of that term," which is a perfectly respectable term. William the Conqueror of England, before he became Conqueror and King of England, as you know, was known as William the Bastard, and it's a perfectly good term. So she told me this story, which gets the idea across without using the term. And in case any of you are a little shaky about it, you can use this way around. This is the story of an old Vermonter who went into a night lunch cart, got some donuts and coffee, and when he got ready to leave, he put down 3 pennies for a tip. And the waitress, Vermont lady, said, "You know, I can tell the character of you fellas by the tips you leave." "Is that so?" he said. "Oh, what do you make of those 3 pennies?" "Well," she said, "the first penny means that you are a very thrifty man." "Well," he said, "by God, that's right." Now, she says, "the second penny means that you're a bachelor." "Well," he said, "that's right, too." Then she started away, and he says, "Hold on, you ain't said nothing about that third penny." "Well," she says, "if you really want to know, that third penny means that your father was a bachelor, too." So that takes care of that. I got along years ago, 30 years ago, I guess, I made my first contact with the town in Vermont, which is a little to the north and west of Norwich, which is spelled Corinth. This is named after the classical city of Corinth in Greece. I went through that Corinthian canal one time by ship. But that first time I started up there, I asked the old fellow if this was the road to Corinth. And he said, "What'd you say?" I said, "I wondered if this was the road to Corinth." He said, "Where'd you want to go?" Well, I said, damned if I know. I thought I wanted to go to Corinth. Oh, he says, you mean Corinth. And that's the way it goes. Well, I got acquainted with some of the kids up in... I used to go up to East Corinth quite a lot. Their library burned, and they built a new one, and I helped them pick a motto to go over the door, which, incidentally, I pass on to you if you're ever going to dedicate a library, Bishop. Over the door of the one of the entrances of the Palais de Chaillot in Paris has this in French. The English translation is, it all depends upon him who enters here, whether this be a tomb or a treasure house. And certainly that is most applicable to a library. It can be a tomb or it can be a great treasure house. Well, I'm getting off my story. One of the boys up there, they only go up to the 8th grade. They have to go over to Bradford to go to high school. But one of these kids told me that in the Friday afternoons in the elementary school in Corinth, they have an assembly. And one class will take over this week, the 4th grade and the 5th grade and the 6th grade and so forth. And I said, what do you do in the assemblies? And this kid says, oh, we recite things we've learned, like from Lowell and Longfellow and Whittier. Speakings, he says we call them. Well, I said, that's a fine idea. We used to do that down in Framingham where I grew up. Yes, he says, but sometimes we recite things we wrote ourselves. Well, I said, that's better than we used to do. I'd be curious, have you had occasion to recite anything you wrote yourself? He said, yes, last Friday I did. Well, I said, how'd it go? Well, he says, it went like this. As I was sitting in a shady nook along beside a babbling brook, I saw a lovely little lass standing in water up to her knees. Well, I said, that's pretty good, but it doesn't seem to rhyme. And this is where the Vermonter came through. He says, well, that's what the teacher said. But I told her you had to remember it'd been a hell of a dry fall. Well, perhaps that's enough for those. You can see how they play the game and how effective it is. I wanted to perhaps say something about just one or two stories about Vermont and Texas. Those are the only two states in the Union that enjoyed a really independent existence before they joined the Union. Or, as one old Vermonter said to me, afore we stuck our neck in the yoke of Union. And it's damn well callous by now, too, he says. But incidentally, the Republic of Vermont endured for some 13 years, from 1777 to 1791, when Vermont came in as the 14th state. The Lone Star Republic in Texas lasted only for 9 years, from 1836 to 1845. I was down in Texas one time and talking about this, and one old Texan got up and he says, that can't be so, Professor. Texas leads in everything. Of course, since Alaska's come in, why, they've been put in their place anyway. But I said, well, that may be so, brother, but there are such things as facts. And Vermont was independent for 13 years, and Texas was only independent for 9. Well, they tell about this Vermonter. This has to have a little license, one of these, ornithological license, about the Vermonter who finally got down to Texas and was out riding with his Texas friend. And they saw a very bright plumaged bird along the road. And the Vermonter says to his Texas friend, what bird's that? The Texan said, that, my friend, is a bird of paradise. Huh, said the Vermonter, a long way from home, ain't he? And then they tell about this same Vermonter getting to a men's club meeting. This would have to be before 1952 because party lines have been disrupted in other places beside Vermont. And they've been a little off the beam down in Texas there. But before 52, they were pretty straight, democratic. And this Texan took Vermonter to this men's meeting, and he thought he'd have a little fun knowing there was Vermonter there, so he said, Will all those who are Democrats please stand up? And everybody stood up with this lone Vermonter. Then he says, if by any chance there's a stray Republican get in here, stray Republican wanted in, would he mind standing up? And the lone Vermonter stood up and everybody laughed. And the chairman says, could you tell it how it is, my friend, that you happen to be a Republican? Vermonter said, I'd be glad to tell you. 2 reasons only. In the first place, I come from Vermont. And in the second place, my father was Republican before me. Texas chairman says, that's a very poor reason for being Republican. Very poor reason indeed, supposing your father had been a horse thief. Well, said the Vermonter, I reckon in that case I'd been Democrat. Well, now, I've been trying to catch a Texan in Vermont. They don't come up here much, but last summer I ran into a Texan in Montpelier, of all places, and he wanted to know what the hell was going on, and we had quite a visit. And he told me that he'd asked this friend of his, he said this friend of his, he'd like to see a real Vermont farm. Not one of these show places, you know, but a nice old farm, been in the family for some generations. And he said, I'll tell you, I had my eyes open. This friend took me up to this nice Vermont farm, and farmer was out there, and I got out, you know, and you can hear him saying, how do you do, how do you do? It's glad to meet you, quite a place you got here. How much land you got? Vermont farmer says, oh, I got pretty good-sized farm. I got about 275 acres. Texan said, that's a piddling small place. Piddling small place. Why, down Texas, I get my car to drive half a day before I get to the corner of my ranch. Yes, says the Vermonter, I had a car like that once, but I got rid of it. Then I have one other genuine piece here that I'll bring in, and we'll bring this to a close. There's a construction firm in Hanover named Trumbull and Nelson. And Dale Nelson is the Nelson. And he did a job for a fellow in Bethel, Vermont once, not as Trumbull Nelson, but just as Dale Nelson. And he sent him a bill, and he received this reply with this note, which Dale passed on to me a long time ago, writing down at the bottom, just Vermont, Dale Nelson. He said, you can use it as you will. It was a long time ago. It's dated June 1, 1950. And it says, Mr. Nelson. You will note that this Vermonter does not say, Dear Mr. Nelson. In the first place, he doesn't think a hell of a lot of Nelson, and it would be hypocritical to write, Dear Mr. Nelson. Furthermore, you save a little time and ink by just saying, Mr. Nelson. It has 2 sentences only. The first reads, enclosed, find, check, as per bill. He paid it. Second sentence, your charge and services were both very unsatisfactory. Yours truly. Now, Dale says he has no doubt what the hell this fellow thought of him, and, you know, most of us, if we get a bill that is unsatisfactory, in the first place, we don't pay it. Second place, we may write a 2-page letter explaining why we think so, and some people are even foolish enough to get into litigation over the thing. But the Vermonter, I think with a certain Vermont characteristic, paid the bill. He discharged his obligation. And then, having squared himself with Mr. Nelson, he reserved the right to tell him what he thought of the situation, and which he did in no uncertain terms. I will close with a little verse that was given me by a lady in New York. One time, Robert Jackson got me to New York years ago to speak to the New England Society of New York in a very swank club on Park Avenue. And at the close of the talk, this very much beminked and bejeweled Park Avenue babe came up and said, oh, Professor Foley, this is the most charming afternoon, and so on. I said, madam, what's your trouble? Well, she said, I do wish that I'd heard your talk 30 years ago. Well, I said, why 30 years ago? because she said I had been married to a Vermonter for 30 years and it's been hell. Well, I said, I'm sure it hasn't been that bad, and she said, of course it hasn't. My husband is really a high-minded Christian gentleman, but if he says, if you really want to go, we will, that's enthusiasm, she said. Everything scales down from that. Well, bless her heart, after a couple of weeks after I got home, I had a note from the lady saying that she and her husband were getting along much better now. That my talk, which was a little fuller than the talk I've given you tonight, had helped her to understand this Vermont husband better. Incidentally, I sometimes, if you want to have another performance sometime, I claim if you could get Mr. Gallup down at the Institute of Public Opinion in Princeton to make a poll of the characteristics of a Vermonter, that you'd get such things as independence and thrift and taciturnity and emotional restraint, and I have a whole collection of stuff that you can build up to support those. But this emotional restraint is one thing that is characteristic of a Vermonter, and this lady learned from my talk that this was part of the background and the nature of the beast, and that it wasn't anything particularly the trouble with her husband, you see. He was just reflecting the background. Incidentally, in regard to that emotional restraint and the lack of demonstrativeness on the part of Vermonters is illustrated by one nice story that I would like to include. This is a true story. Mark Twain, Samuel Langhorne Clemens, came to Brattleboro, Vermont, early in the century, billed to give a humorous lecture. And I checked it up. He spoke in the old opera house down there, and he got $100, 100 Vermont dollars, 60, 70 years ago, which indicates his standing in the world. I don't ordinarily get that much, but I'm not Mark Twain. But I have experienced Mr. Twain's problem that a great many Vermont audiences you speak to, I do if I get back off in the country, salt of the earth, fine old people, but they'll be damned, you know, if they'll laugh, let you know. And most of the time when you're through, if somebody says, well, 'twas good, that's high praise. Most of them don't say a damn thing. But I don't care because I just float around and make the most of it. But Samuel Langhorne Clemens had an international reputation and a DCL from Oxford and all the rest. And to get to Brattleboro and not have much of a response from this crowd rather troubled him. So he brought his talk to a close a little early and went out the stage entrance and round front to see if he could discover what the situation was. And he discovered very promptly. Out came a nice old Vermont couple, arm in arm, you know, the old man going along. They'd come down in the horse and buggy from the hill farm for the lecture. They were going out to ride home together under the October starlit sky, and the old man was saying to the old woman, "Wasn't he funny? Wasn't he funny? I had all I could do to keep from laughing." Well, there's an awful lot of Vermont in that. Well, now to return to my gal friend in New York. In addition to the note that she sent me about how her relations with her husband had picked up since she'd heard my talk on Vermont, she also included a little verse, which I found very handy. She said, if you ever get caught short, Professor, read this and sit down. It says everything you say briefly and better. Well, I don't concur with that, but it does make a nice little... I have about 13 endings that I can use, and I call this number 7. It's entitled Vermonters, and I've discovered that Vermonters don't mind this. It's a tribute to Vermonters, which I personally am happy as an adopted son of Vermont to join in. And I discovered that Vermonters don't mind it at all either, because they, like everyone else, like to be appreciated. But there's some good lines in this verse. Vermonters have bold winters and shy springs. I like that adjective. You know how spring backs and fills in our country. Robert Frost says of an April day, it's so warm you think you're right ahead in the middle of May, and suddenly a wind comes over the frozen arch, and you're right plumb back in the middle of March. That's the way spring comes. Vermonters have bold winters and shy springs, and summers hot as any tropic zone, yet brief. Their countryside is set in rings of low stone walls. Their mountains are their own defense against the world. They stand apart as with a humor both restrained and dry, they look at life with mild sardonic eye and hide a warm and sympathetic heart. Vermonters are hard-bitten, stern, but just, and keep within themselves and spare the tongue. Yet in the kindliness beneath the crust of their reserve, their goodness, though unsung, is echoed in the atmosphere that crowns their neat, compact, and small white steepled towns. They're great people, and among their greatest assets, I think, this business of wit and humor and the sly comeback without much show of anything on their part, but yet which I think inside warms the day for them. Thank you.